Welcome back, y'all. This is the lecture recording for this coming Wednesday. Today is Monday, the 13th of September, I believe. Yeah, that's correct. And this is intended to be viewed in conjunction with what would ordinarily have been Wednesday's class, which, of course, I shouldn't say have been because that implies that we no longer have class, which, of course, we do because that's what this is. Couple of things. You will perhaps take note of the fact that I am no longer in the rather ostentatious and auspicious environs of my dad's office. This is actually the basement of the house that I'm currently living in. My bedroom is just out this door down the hall. You can't see it, but it's over there. Not that that matters. And I'm here for two reasons. First of all, the pragmatic reason, which is out of consideration for the interests of all of you collectively. I think and I hope that this room has better acoustics. I think the sound is actually superior in this room in terms of it actually not getting lost in translation. Because I went through and I actually reviewed and I watched some of those other clips that I had made previously that I uploaded to YouTube. It was painful for me to watch because, as you know, I'm not a fan of my own work and I hate having to suffer through it. But I watched it just to make sure I could actually hear and apprehend the audio. And it seemed to me, and maybe this is not a fair characterization, but it seemed as though there was some lack in the audio quality. And I'm not sure exactly whether that was due to my own interface with it or that was something that was endemic to the video. But for whatever reason, I'm aspiring to create a video which is more conducive to optimizing the actual audio element of the recording. Whether or not that actually happens, we'll see. The other reason I'm down here this Monday night, this dark and dank and rainy Monday night. Of course, you guys can't see this, but I got windows over here. They're actually closed, and I got the blinds drawn, so I can't really see out. But it's a dark night out there, and we're actually supposed to have severe weather here in Metro Detroit later this evening. So I'm down here in anticipation of the possibility of that actually coming to fruition. Now, before any of you insinuate or impute to me cowardice and say, "Oh, well, Jeff, you represented yourself as being this fan of tornadoes and this storm chaser and this amateur weather enthusiast and this, that, and the other thing." Yes, actually, that's true. In fact, what I did last time we had severe weather here, the sirens went off, which is indicative of a tornado actually being spotted on the ground. I was here with my girlfriend, on and off again, ex-girlfriend, and I actually got in my car or I was attempting to get in my car for purposes of actually going out and seeking and then chasing and tracking the tornado. Of course, I can't do that in real time because I don't have a smartphone, so I just have to kind of guesstimate where it's at, which is actually incredibly dangerous. And my on again, off again girlfriend said, "No, Jeff, you're being an idiot. That's absolutely preposterous. It's incredibly dangerous." So I just want you guys to know that if in fact severe weather strikes here while I'm in the midst of this recording, what I'll probably do is I'll grab the laptop. You can't see it where it's at, but it's actually on there's a billiards table over there. Come down here and practice pool skills. I'm gonna grab it and I'm gonna run upstairs with it and put it in my Sequoia and I'm gonna put it on the dashboard and then like do some like recording as I'm driving around and seeking tornadoes. No, I probably won't. I'll probably just shut it and close it and we'll just shut this up and that'll be the end of it. But anyways, that's what brings me down here this evening. So a couple of announcements. First of all, I'm just going to reiterate what I have been saying consistently now for the last couple of weeks, which I hope is not getting too redundant, but I'm going to say it anyways because I think it bears mentioning. If any of you has any constructive criticisms or insights or input or comments or recommendations that may be made in furtherance of enhancing the pedagogical value of this experience, which is to say that if you think that there's anything I'm doing that is unbecoming or disingenuous to your interests as a learner, please do let me know. And I'm not saying that facetiously or in a way that's not actually true and genuine and forthcoming. I really do mean that because I wouldn't be consistently reiterating and recapitulating the same semantic trope again and again and again, but for the fact that I really do take my obligations to you guys very seriously. In fact, all the more so precisely because we are devolving into a distance learning type paradigm. Right now, as I said, and as I think I made this very abundantly, conspicuously clear to all before I left a couple of weeks ago, but I will be back in October. All right. Now, maybe by the time I get back, you guys won't want me back. right? Because you say, oh, well, we've acclimated ourselves to this whole YouTube thing, and it's working out great because take-home tests, we get all the time in the world. We can use our books, we can use our notes, we can use the PowerPoint slides, we can use the YouTube lectures, we can use whatever materials we can find to supplement and enhance our understanding of the materials, whilst contemporaneously actually taking the exam. Whereas when I come back, it's going to be sort of old school traditional formatting, in which case you guys are going to have to sit in the classroom. You're going to be constrained in terms of limited use of notes, in fact, no use of notes. You're going to be relegated to the old-fashioned way of doing things. And look, I mean, I'm completely amenable to continuing to do YouTube, right? The college doesn't really impose any strictures on me, so maybe that's a conversation we ought to have in the future. Well, it's a conversation that I'm going to have with myself down here in the basement or up there in my dad's office. But either way, it's going to be a monologue. But I invite you guys to participate in the sense that you can give me feedback. The other just perfunctory sort of administrative point I want to make here is that, and I think I said this last time, but I think I said this by email, so I want to just reinforce what I conveyed by email because I think it's imperative for you guys to hear it. If for any reason any of you has any questions or concerns or whatever happens to seize you at any given time, and you have the inclination or the impulse to contact me, by all means, I invite you to do so. In fact, I highly recommend and encourage you to do so. And I very much look forward to the conversations that may conceivably follow as a result of you contacting me. I think I had mentioned in that email that I sent out a few days ago, I think it was last Friday that I sent this out, maybe it was Thursday, I can't remember which, that I had actually had a very fruitful and highly constructive and very edifying conversation with one of the comrades. I'm not going to say who it was, but we talked about history, we talked about video games, we talked about computers, we talked about current events. We talked about a lot of things, right? Everything under the sun. We had a great time. But the point is that we talked for almost 2 hours. Okay. Now that wasn't an encumbrance for me. It wasn't an imposition. And I made it very clear to that comrade that I didn't care. Right. So if any of you want to take up my time, right, I'm not doing a whole lot down here. Okay, I've got this thing, this process documentation thing, whereby I go and I collaborate with my partner down here. We go into these factories, we look at stuff, we take notes, we do some shit, and we get out of there. We come back here and hang out. But besides that, I've got this class and I got an online class, and the online class pretty much takes care of itself because I got all that stuff already uploaded to Moodle. So I really don't have many obligations outside of this class, and therefore I feel as though I should convey to you guys that I am maximally available, and the opportunity is yours to lose or yours to fail to seize upon if in fact you don't choose to avail yourself of it, right? Which hopefully you actually do. If in fact you feel the need to actually reach out and to contact me and actually have some kind of conversation and engage with this stuff further, because I don't think I'm downplaying any of the content just by virtue of promulgating and disseminating this via YouTube. I don't think that I'm in any way shortchanging you, if you will. I think that I'm giving the same kind of assessment and the same kind of analysis and the same kind of analytically driven sort of conceptual framework that I would be providing to you if in fact we were in the confines of a physical classroom. So I don't think there's much of a disparity there qualitatively speaking. But if you think there is, or if you have a problem, or if you feel as though I'm doing you any sort of disservice, please do let me know. And I really do invite you to contact me either way, whether it's constructive criticisms, whether it's just to shoot the shit, whether you want to talk about history, whether you want clarification on something, whatever the nature of the concern happens to be. You got my number, you got my email. Please do reach out, contact me. Okay. Now, the other thing that I wanted to do today, okay, well, there's many things I want to do today, but one of the other things I want to do is in pursuant to my pledge, and I don't know if you guys remember this, but the very beginning of the very first class, I think it was the first class, it may have been the very beginning of the second class, but either way, what I said from the onset of the semester is one of the things I'm going to try to do throughout the course of the term, our time together, is to try to make history as relevant and as tangible and as tractable and as pertinent as I possibly can for you, and to contemporize it in the sense that I'm trying to make these themes and these ideas, these abstractions that we talk about in the context of the French Revolution right now, and then in the context of Napoleon, and then in the context of the revolutions of 1848, and then so on and so forth as we go along the trajectory of history. I'm trying to make this stuff as relevant and applicable to the day in which you and I are both living right now as I possibly can. And in furtherance of that aspirational objective, what I have here is a great magazine. Actually, I'm gonna put a little plug in here for this. I don't know how well this resolves on the camera. Probably not very well. It's really glossy, so it's got this sort of shimmer to it. But this is called The Week magazine. Okay. And for those of you who are very concerned about partisan contamination that has this sort of ideological inflection point with respects to news media, and if you watch CNN, you'll know what I'm talking about. And conversely, if you watch Fox News, you'll know what I'm talking about, right? There's a propagandistic dynamic to both of those enterprises. And to not say that, to not concede that point, seems to me to be intellectually dishonest, right? So if you want to go to a source of news media this day and age, which is, I don't want to say completely objective and entirely dispassionate, entirely equitable and fair and balanced in its interpretation and presentation of relevant information and insights as they derive from what's happening in current events, but it's as close to that as it possibly conceivably be. All right. So what this week magazine does is it actually aggregates bits and pieces of news publications that have come across through various forms of media, whether it's the Associated Press, whether it's the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Detroit Free Press, whatever it happens to be, and it just kind of consolidates all this stuff. So it gives you as fair and as impartial an interpretation of what's actually happening current events wise as it possibly can. Right? I'm not doing this because this is a sales pitch. I make no money if you go out there and you subscribe to the Week magazine. I wish I did, because maybe you will now. I'm just saying this because I actually tend to be pretty cognizant of what's actually happening in terms of the world around us, by virtue, not exclusively, but primarily by virtue of having read this magazine on a regular basis. So, anyways, one of the sections of this magazine, this is the second to most recent magazine. I'm a little bit behind on the mail cycle because my mail is kind of lost in translation. It's in limbo somewhere, as it often happens to be with the USPS nowadays. But this is a little article that I'm not going to take up much of your time, I promise. But nevertheless, this is important. And by the way, because it's important, therefore it is testable. All right, this is fair game for any future examinations you may actually, well, you will, well, not actually, yes, you may have a test in this class, right? But when that test actually materializes, when it transpires, this sort of thing, the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about in the context of this kind of magazine, this kind of publication, is fair game for test questions. So pay attention, listen up, hear what I'm going to say, and let's actually delve into this. So this is a little article, and it's talking about the diplomatic relations and the deterioration of the diplomatic relations between Israel and Poland. And I was going to read this for you, and then I'm going to give you I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions, and I guess I'll be answering them myself, as is par for the course around here, and even before I got in front of the YouTube video recording screen. So the article says, well, it's not an article, it's a description. Okay, it says, in Warsaw, there is a clash with Israel. Israel and Poland recalled each other's ambassadors this week in a spat over the restitution of Jewish property that was stolen by the Nazis during World War II and later seized by Poland's communist regime. President Andrzej Duda, that's the president of Poland, approved a law last week that sets a 30-year limit on claims to property, which means that most wartime claims can no longer be litigated. The Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid said that the law, quote, anti-Semitic, and the law was, quote, anti-Semitic and immoral. Poland said it might also suspend the annual Holocaust commemoration trips many Israeli high school students take to Poland, with Deputy Foreign Minister Paweł Jablowski saying that such tours, quote, sometimes instill hatred for Poland in the heads of young Israelis, end quote. The Duda government has long complained about Holocaust scholarship implicating Poles in Nazi crimes committed on occupied Polish territory. Okay, so what's going on in Poland? Well, as you may or may not know, Poland is ruled by a very nationalistic, sort of right-wing, chauvinistic government, a political party which emphasizes and accentuates the greatness of Poland and the great contributions of Polish nationals over the years, and in many ways sort of diminishes or de-emphasizes the contributions of non-Polish people historically, in terms of their contributions to the evolution of Polish culture and their heritage and the significance that they have for the history of Poland. It's a Pole-centric way of conceptualizing the past and emphasizing the contributions, not exclusively but predominantly, of the Poles. And the problem here is, as the Poles perceive it anyways, is that they have sort of this very complicated history. Because if you go back to the Second World War, you will see that Yes, indeed, the Poles were victimized by the Nazi occupation. Many people in Poland, not just the Jews, but also the Polish intelligentsia, the academia, the members of the professors, the administrators of the universities, and the priests, especially the priests and the clergy and such, they were subject to the Holocaust, the exterminatory efforts of the Holocaust. And the SS went through, they rounded them up, they sent them out Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Sobibor, Treblinka, Maidenhead, and all the other extermination facilities across, mostly in Poland, is where those camps are situated, right? And so Poland suffered tremendously, cataclysmically, inestimably during the course of the Second World War. Yet you could say that for all their suffering, for all the depredations that were done to the Polish people, in particular the Catholics and the Polish nationals and the partisans of Poland, the suffering of the Jews of Poland was of a greater magnitude. It was orders of magnitude greater because there were more Jews that were killed as a result of the Nazi occupation. Per capita, much greater per capita than there were Poles killed relative to the Polish population. So more Jews killed relative to the Jewish population of Poland than there were Poles killed relative to the population of Poland at that time, if that makes any sense. Now, the reason this is a complicated history, and the reason there's this spat, this diplomatic disagreement, as they characterize it as, is because if you look and examine the record of many Poles during the Second World War, many of them were participants in the Holocaust. They actually helped facilitate it. Now, they weren't the guys who were actually running the crematoria. They weren't the ones who were superintending the shower facility, the shower facility, which were actually disguised. They weren't actually shower facilities. They were gassing facilities. These guys weren't the guys who were intimately involved in the exterminatory processes, yet they were necessary. And I actually wrote a paper about this in graduate school many years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, when I was studying to get my graduate degree in history, which asserted that the Nazis could not have achieved the kind of success, if you want to apply that term to genocide, they couldn't have been so successful in terms of committing the genocide that they did against the Jews and the Gypsies and the communists and the Russians and the Soviet commissars and all the other people that fell within the category of those who were subject to special treatment, to use the euphemistic phrase of the Germans. They couldn't have done all that had it not been for the complicity of local populations such as the Ukrainians, such as the Latvians, such as the Estonians, and most conspicuously, I think, the Poles. And so the people of Poland, contemporary modern day 2021 Poland, are, I think, I don't want to say rightfully, because I don't want to mischaracterize this, but I think understandably they are concerned about how certain countries will perceive their legacy and their history and their participation vis-a-vis the Nazi genocide in the context of Poland during the 1940s, when the Holocaust was in full swing, and rightfully so. And they're very concerned about how young Israelis are experiencing the Holocaust, or the tradition, the history of the Holocaust, as they come to Poland and they view facilities like Auschwitz and Birkenau and Sobibor and Maidenhead and Treblinka and all the other camps that were associated with something called Operation Reinhardt, which is actually named after a guy by the name of Reinhard Heydrich. We're going to get into this stuff many weeks in the future. Well, not many weeks, but probably about 2 months in the future. We are going to talk about the Holocaust. At least I hope to get to that point, if in fact we ever get there, if we have time for it, because that's something that is absolutely integral and indispensable to furthering your understanding of Western civilization, because it has its goods, it has its ups, it has its downs. But in the course of that extermination, in the course of the Holocaust, in the darkest hours of the 20th century, I think you could probably characterize it at, without really embellishing it, you would have to say, I think you have to concede as a matter of fact, that the Holocaust could not have happened to the extent that it did. It wouldn't have been as successful as it was, but for the contributions of people who were Polish nationals, who were Polish citizens. And indeed, maybe they were animated and motivated by anti-Semitism, maybe they were animated and motivated by greed, maybe they were animated and motivated by covetousness, they wanted that which their neighbors had, maybe they were just concerned about their own well-being, and they were concerned about the reprisals that would be taken against them if in fact they did not co-opt and assist and facilitate these processes on behalf of the Nazis. So it's a very complicated legacy, but the concern that I have with respects to what I just read there in that little brief précis of what's actually happening in the context of the relations between Poland and Israel. Well, the concern that I have as somebody who has a passion and a high degree of respect and a reverence indeed for history. The first concern is that this seems to me to be in some way disingenuous to the factual historical narrative. Because what the polls are essentially saying is that we don't like the fact that young Israeli school children come here to Warsaw, or come here to Krakow, or come here to Lublin, okay, which is the big city in the south of Poland where there's this big massive Jewish ghetto that the Nazis put all the Jews and many other people in. And we don't like the fact that these young Jewish school children are being exposed to a particularized historical narrative, which in many ways represents the people of Poland as having been collaborators on behalf of and in furtherance of the Nazi war efforts against the Jews in this particular place and time. We don't like that because it reflects very poorly upon us. Now, is that a fair assertion on behalf of the people of Poland? Is that, understand that this is coming from the nationalist right, this is coming from the Poles who are very chauvinistic, who are very patriotic, who are very concerned about how the world perceives them, and particularly they're concerned about how the generations which have succeeded the Holocaust generation, because most of the people who live in Israel came from Europe. And you, if you know anybody in Israel, right? And I do because my ex-girlfriend slash ex-fiance is actually herself a former Russian, Ukrainian actually. She's born in Ukraine, but she herself is Jewish Ukrainian, and she has family and relatives in Israel. But if you know anybody in Israel, you know that just about everybody in Israel knows somebody in their own family, from their own familial history, that was in some way victimized by the Holocaust, right? In some measurable, appreciable way, they were affected, and usually in a very profoundly deleterious way, by the consequences of the Nazi policies during the 40s and across Europe. And so I think it's fair to say that the children in Israel are highly motivated in their thirst for knowledge concerning how this actually played out. What actually happened in Poland at this time during the 40s as their great-grandparents were being exterminated or loaded onto cattle trains and sent off to places like Auschwitz, whereby they were either interned in deplorable, inhuman conditions, or in fact they actually were killed. And so I think I can understand from the perception, from the standpoint of the Poles, how they don't want this particular history to be too biased or subjective, prejudicial against them, in the sense that it may contrive to make the Poles look much worse than they actually were. But look, if the Poles were complicit in this process, and this process resulted in the extermination of millions of Jews in Poland, then it seems to me to say that you have a culpability for that. You have a responsibility for that. And yes, there's no such thing as, the sins of our fathers devolve upon us. Absolutely not, right? That's a misconceptualization, right? That's not actually true. This notion of vicarious liability, it does not pertain. But the concern that I have with all this is that if Poland gets away with saying that, well, this history is inconvenient for us. It's inconvenient because it doesn't necessarily bode favorably for us here now, contemporary Poland in the 21st century. And therefore we ought to downplay it. We ought to diminish its significance. We ought to constrain the ability that otherwise young children would have to actually immerse themselves in this history by going to these places where this history actually transpired 75 years ago. To say that we don't want this history to be promulgated or perpetuated or disseminated is to say that you're adverse to the continuation of the factual record. Because it seems to me that this is exactly what's happening in our own country. I mean, to say that the history of the South is one that in some ways is shameful. It is shameful, and therefore we ought to efface it, and we ought to extricate it from the history books because it's painful and it's shameful, and people would rather not remember and commemorate those things. Well, that, again, I think is disingenuous, right? It's disingenuous because it's looking at the historical record and looking at it selectively and saying, we're only going to immerse ourselves in things that we like. We're only going to immerse ourselves in the sorts of things that are celebratory and auspicious and wonderful and great and that we have a right to be proud of. Well, there are certain aspects of your past which are very shameful. They are the antithesis of things that would bring pride and satisfaction to an individual. So that's really all I think I need to say about that. Now, moving along. One of the things that I left off with the last time I spoke to you guys, which I think would have been, I think you would have listened to that today, by the way. I don't think it's actually, I think I had mentioned this before, but I'll just mention it real quick because I'm thinking about it right now. It's not imperative that you guys necessarily watch these videos on the appointed day and certainly not at the appointed time. I mean, if you really only have that time block because you're so busy and you got 3 or 4 jobs and you got kids to take care of and you got a boyfriend or a girlfriend and you got all kinds of other competing obligations, you only have from 9 a.m. till 10:53 a.m. every Monday and Wednesday morning to actually dedicate to the cultivation of your mind as it relates to the study of history. If that's all you've got, then that's all you got, and that's what you got to do. But I'm not going to say that you necessarily have to watch these videos at that particular time. And one of the reasons I'm trying to do what I'm doing, which is to try to upload these as promptly as I possibly can, is so that you have a little bit of leverage, right? You have some room to move and to be selective with respect to when you actually listen to this stuff. All right. So one of the things that I talked about, I don't want to move too far away from the camera here, guys, but I also want to be able to sit down because I'm tired. And I actually one of the disadvantages of doing this way is that I'm doing this at the end of my day. So I've gone to the gym, I've gone shopping, I played some PC games today, I did my lawn, I did the yard, right? So I'm pretty bedraggled right now. So that may be the reason as to why I don't seem as enthused or as hyperactive, as spontaneous and eccentric as I usually do in the context of our early morning sessions. But hey, what can you do, right? This is the best I can do, and unfortunately, this is as good as it's going to get. So let's talk about Louis the 16th. All right. Now, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, one of the last things I left off with last time was talking about a conversation which was analyzing and assessing the reasons which led to the radicalization of the French Revolution. And we identified a couple, all right? I think the first reason we talked about was something about how, well, Louis wanted to go out there and he wanted to collaborate and conspire with other leaders of monarchist nations across Europe, and he was going to conspire and he was going to collaborate with these people, and then he was going to go out there and recruit a loyal army of soldiers, foreign nationals, and then come back and then usurp the power that had been dispossessed of him from the people and reestablish himself as the rightful sovereign monarch over the French. And that was a concern for most French people because the French people perceived that, I think rightfully construed that, as in many ways a repudiation of the Constitution, a repudiation of the pledge that Louis XVI had given the people. He gave his solemn oath. He swore his solemn oath solemnly and honestly in the presence of the people and in the name of the Lord. He swore that he would uphold and defend and abide by the Constitution as it had been promulgated by the National Assembly. Now, if you are the king and you defer to that document, and that document stipulates that now you have a constitutional monarchy, you don't have an absolute monarchy anymore, right? Then you are essentially abnegating, right? You are abnegating, right? You're not abdicating, right? And abdicating it versus abnegation. Abnegation is I'm relinquishing certain powers that I formerly had. I'm doing so volitionally. Okay, so he's abnegating. All right, abnegating. That's a word. I'm not making this up. Whereas abdicating is you're coming down off the throne and then you become a common citizen and you have no special privileges and you have no special powers anymore whatsoever, right? So he's not abdicating, he's abnegating, right? He's abnegating certain of his, I guess you could say, sovereign royal prerogatives that he previously enjoyed, the privileges of rule, which he previously enjoyed. And in furtherance of ensuring that the interests of the common people were protected and the progress of the revolution was safeguarded, what the National Assembly decided to do was to convene and to determine the culpability, the legal and the moral culpability of Louis XVI as it pertained to his alleged conspiratorial activities against the Constitutional Assembly. Now we left off with this, and this is a very important moment in time. And I think what I ought to have done, and I think I may have been a little bit sketchy in terms of rendering these arguments for you. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to recapitulate some of this stuff because I think it's important to understand the arguments on both sides. What I ordinarily do in the context of a conventional sort of physical classroom, when we're sitting vis-a-vis each other, and we got people out there in the stands. What I usually do is I say, okay, well, I want you guys to imagine that you are the advocate on behalf of the National Assembly. Okay, remember the National Assembly was basically the people's legislation, right? They were the legislatures who were acting on behalf of and in furtherance of the interests of the common people of Paris and the rest of France. And they were elected, they were duly appointed, they sat in these chambers and they voted in a democratic fashion so as to promulgate legislation which was, at least in theory, in the best interest of the common people.
right? So you have this National Assembly, right? And ordinarily, what I would do is say, okay, well, let's go ahead and let's pretend that we are the advocates, we are the representatives of the National Assembly, looking to vindicate the rights of the people as they had been transgressed upon by this very audacious and very arbitrary monarch, Louis XVI, who was ruling in a very profligate and promiscuous manner, and therefore we are seeking to indict him for treason, high treason against the people and against the state of France. And so you have to conceptualize that in your mind. What are the arguments? What are the various elements in the bill of indictment? How would you actually make that case? And then contrast that, conversely, with what is the defense going to argue? What is the defense for Louis going to assert in his defense? What are they going to say? Well, let's start off with I think the defense actually has some very interesting points. So let's start off with that. Louis is being accused of high treason, right? He's being accused of committing treason, betrayal essentially of his nation, betrayal of his country, betrayal of the people, betrayal of the Constitution that he swore allegiance to. And I think one of the first things you have to say is, well, at the time that Louis did what he did, okay, at the time, well, let's start with what he actually did with respects to, because one of the charges against him was it's not just treason, right? It's treason through various actions, right? Treason is kind of an amorphous concept, right? It's an abstract idea, right? What is treason? Well, what is the mechanics of treason? You actually have to take some kind of action in furtherance of consummating a treasonous form of conduct. You can't just say, well, this person is treasonous without adducing any evidence or proofs that they had actually done something which is in furtherance of their intent to commit treason. And so what is the evidence that Louis XVI actually intended to commit treason? Well, he sent the National Guard, he sent his soldiers in to Paris to suppress the riotous and raucous, violent activity of the people as they were rampaging through the streets because they were demanding change and because they were liberating the prisoners from the Bastille, that old fort that was in the center of Paris. They kicked down the door, they dragged some people out, they guillotined the commander, they freed some prisoners, right? And it was a disorderly, chaotic situation. And so Louis XVI orders his soldiers to come in there and to suppress and to put down this madness, which was causing destruction of property and possible injuries to civilians, innocent people, and etc. And the indictment against Louis, which stipulates that while you're engaged in treasonous activity against the state, said, well, one way of measuring that treason, one way of, I guess, confirming and substantiating the treason, to assert that you sent your soldiers in a very arbitrary manner without actually conferring with the National Assembly before you did this, pursuant to the Constitution, because now you're a constitutional monarch, right? You're not an absolute monarch, right? And Louis, of course, is saying, well, I don't think that the people, even through their elected legislature, has the right to impose upon me certain constraints. The people don't have the right to essentially create a constitution which places limitations on my power, which previously was unlimited. It was absolute. It was unconstrained by any constitutional stipulations. And I think that that's one of the arguments that, well, I know that's one of the arguments that Louis XVI and his advocates were making for him at his trial, because they actually put him on trial. And they had, I don't know if you guys have ever seen, it was called A Man for All Seasons. It was a Shakespeare play and was eventually turned into a movie starring, I want to say it was Robert Redford, but it was a movie before my time, so I can't actually remember who it was. But it's about the trial, it's about the life, the latter stages of life, and eventually the trial and the indictment and the prosecution and eventually the execution of Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, who was a Catholic theologian and a philosopher and a confidant of Henry VIII. Whom you will probably know as being one of the individuals who was most responsible for the creation of the Church of England, and still to this day is remembered as sort of an apostate to the Catholic faith because he decided to take retribution against the Catholic Church for not agreeing to nullify his marriage to Anne Boleyn, I think it was, and he had other marriages and he wanted those annulled, and he wanted his divorces sanctioned and sanctified by the Pope, and he wouldn't grant that, and so he went off and formed his own church, and well, the rest is history, as they say. But if you remember that movie, and you probably don't have any idea what I'm talking about, but it's about the trial and then later the execution of Thomas More, and the reason I'm adducing that is because it's very much reminiscent. There's this great scene in this movie where there's this giant hall. It's like this big hall, and there's all these chairs. It's like these bleachers, and there's all these old guys with these like wigs that are sitting there, and these are the representatives of the people in England, in merry old England, the 16. Oh, I guess it would have been the 1580s actually. And all these guys are supposed, this is the Parliament of the UK, the United Kingdom, England, right? And the Parliament of England is judging the guilt, is assessing the guilt and the legal culpability of Thomas More as he stands accused of treason against the king, because he wouldn't actually declare that what the Pope did was wrong and unlawful, because he was a true Catholic and he wanted to die a martyr. And we know that martyrs are very hardcore in their beliefs, because you know what martyrs do in Syria? They drive Toyota Hiluxes and they blow themselves up and they carry AK-47s around with them. So Thomas More was a martyr of that variety. He wasn't a martyr for ISIS. He wasn't a martyr for Allah. He was a martyr for the Christian God. But the trial of Thomas More was very much synonymous. It was very much reminiscent of the trial of King Louis XVI, or perhaps the other way around, because Louis XVI was tried about 150 years after Thomas More was tried. But I imagine in my mind, when I try to imagine what this must have looked like, and one of the things I want you guys to do is to, you don't have to close your eyes right now because I'm not very good at visualizing these things, but just imagine what it must have been like. You come into this giant chamber, this giant, imagine both houses of Congress in the Capitol building, and there's hundreds of delegates, right? I think there's 734 delegates, right? 734 delegates, right? And you can the contempt that they feel towards you is palpable. It's you can feel it in the air, right? And you're Louis XVI, and you know why they're doing what they're doing. They're doing it because they can. They're doing it because they feel as though they must. And they're doing it, many of them are doing it because they feel as though they have no choice. And we're going to get to that in a minute when I actually turn to the reasons as to why the prosecution felt they had a pretty strong case against Louis. But back to the defense. So the prosecution is saying that Louis stands in contempt of the Constitution because he acted in a manner that was contrary to his authority as it was defined pursuant to the terms of the Constitution. Now, Louis is trying to say that, well, this is essentially holding me accountable to standards that didn't exist when I actually became king. And so you're imposing upon me the result of ex post facto law, which had been promulgated after the fact. I had power, I had authority, I had certain sovereign rights that were invested in me when I became king. So says Louis XVI through his attorneys, through his representatives and his advocates. And he says that you can't necessarily hold me accountable for laws that are promulgated after the fact when you who promulgated those laws, you who met under the auspices of the National Convention, didn't actually have the right to meet in the first place and to promulgate a constitution. So how can I, Louis XVI, be held to a constitution, held accountable to the stipulations contained in the Constitution, when you don't have the right to convene and actually create and draft and then disseminate a constitution in the first place? You don't have that right because the law, the ancient regime, the absolute monarchy that existed before you and the people and all the riffraff from the streets, the peasants and whoever else, the sans culotte, the guys not wearing pants that are destroying things in the streets of Paris, none of you had the right to do any of that. And you just decided unilaterally, independent of legal precedent, independent of history and tradition and heritage and the way things had always been done in the context of this country for hundreds of years, you decided to go out there and create your own constitution, and then that constitution bound me unilaterally because I didn't agree to it. I didn't agree to it until after you actually presented it to me with the threat that if I didn't actually endorse this and sign on with it, then there would be severe ramifications and dire implications for me, the king. Right? So what's the problem here? This is the notion of ex post facto law. All right, this is, I think, the strongest argument that Louis XVI had. And I want you guys to be able to go through and conduct this kind of analysis because this is absolutely central to the historical methodology. And I think I told you guys right from the get-go, right out the gate in the first day, one of the things that history, the study, the real, true, genuine study of history is going to condition in you is the capacity to engage dialectically and analytically with critical thinking processes, which will enable you to understand very complex analytical problems, deconstruct them and interpret them for yourselves, and then recapitulate that analysis in a way that actually makes sense to you and hopefully somebody who's listening to you. Now, if you can do that, you're doing just as good as me, okay? And that's what I'm trying to do here for you. I don't have any, I'm not looking at any notes. This is how we got to think about this, all right? So, argument number one is this on behalf of the king, right? In his defense, okay, is you can't hold me accountable for ex post facto law. What does ex post facto law mean? Ex post facto law, well, an example. Let me give you an illustration, right? And it pertains to speeding laws because you guys know that I like to obey the speed limit at all times, right? You know, this is a YouTube video. It's going to be public domain, so people can actually go back and watch this after the fact, right? I always go at least usually 5 under the speed limit, actually, right? I drive like I'm driving Miss Daisy, no matter how much of a hurry I'm in. Now, I think you guys know, you who know me better than that probably know that that may not actually be entirely true. But nevertheless, let's say that the speed limit on 41 going through just past the airport there, the Houghton County Memorial Airport is, let's say it's 55 right now, right? Well, let's say next week they decide the Houghton County Road Commission gets together, or the town council or whoever is responsible for promulgating speed limits, they get together and they say, you know what, let's bring it down to 45 miles an hour, okay? And uh, then somebody comes back. Let's say a police officer had observed you going 55, 56 miles an hour a week before they actually promulgate this new law, which lowers the speed limit down to 45, right? And then they try to go out there and they try to issue you a citation for going 55 or 56 in a 45 when you could not have known that the limit was 45 because that law hadn't actually come into effect yet, right? So what it's essentially doing is it's holding you accountable. The concept of ex post facto law is essentially holding you accountable to laws that hadn't yet come into effect. They hadn't come to fruition yet, right? And it's essentially saying that you can be tried in the future for things that weren't actually crimes for behavior that wasn't criminalized when you actually undertook to complete it. Okay, and that's the argument that Louis XVI essentially is making. He's saying that what I was doing when I was doing these things was in accordance with my authority, my divinely sanctioned authority, which came from the Lord, which was sanctified and solidified by the church. That is authority that I've relied upon, my family and my predecessors, the Capetians, all the way back to the Merovingians, the dynasties that have ruled France over the course of the past 600-700 years. We have relied upon that since time immemorial. And you're coming along, and in the course of a fortnight, that's a very stupid reference to an even more stupid game. In the course of a fortnight, you can say, we're going to turn that all on its head, right? And we're going to say, well, you know what? All that history, all that tradition, all that legal precedent no longer means anything, okay? We're going to repudiate it. We're going to nullify it. We're going to obviate it. We're going to completely extricate it from the record. And now we're going to hold you to a new standard, which you yourself couldn't fully apprehend, and which you yourself, by the way, Louis XVI didn't agree to be held to the standard until he actually was brought before the National Assembly and went ahead and signed his name and said, I do hereby pledge to honor and uphold this Constitution that was promulgated by this National Assembly. Until he did that, until he was meant to sign and officiate and actually notarize that, and bring it into effect as a legal doctrine which actually had tangible value, until that actually happened, you can't say that he was bound by the stipulations that were promulgated in the Constitution, because he didn't agree to it. Now, what about after he agreed to the Constitution, right? Because there's time A, Louis, before he actually went along and said, yeah, even though there's this National Assembly, and even though I don't necessarily recognize the right to convene, and certainly don't recognize the right to actually create a constitution, I'm going to go ahead and recognize that Constitution, right? Now, it seems to me to be rather paradoxical of him to do that, okay? If he doesn't recognize the right of the National Assembly to go together and to create this legislative precedent, right, this new Constitution, because he still respects the old Constitution. Of course he respects it, because it gives him unlimited powers, an absolute monarch, right? And so this new Constitution comes into effect, and the National Assembly drags Louis in. I mean, they don't drag him kicking and screaming. They ask him, right? And he comes in. But there is the insinuation, the imputation, the implication that if he doesn't come in, and if he doesn't acquiesce, and if he doesn't sign on to this Constitution, and if he doesn't solemnly swear in a public assembly to uphold and to respect and defer to the stipulations contained therein, well, then there may be ramifications, right? That the National Assembly may very well do what it's intending to do. In fact, it may very well do more than it's going to do if, in fact, it has the acquiescence of the king. Because if the king realizes that if he goes along with the National Assembly, he signs on to this document, he recognizes the authority of the National Assembly to create a new constitution, well, then they're only going to go so far, right? Because he looks good to the people, and because what this is really all about is serving and furthering the interests of the common people. That's why this National Assembly exists, because it's there at the behest of the common, the poor people, the sans culottes. So I keep probably mispronouncing them in French, right? The guys who don't have pants, right? Sans, not wearing, not having, culotte, pants, the type of riding pants they had, right? So I think Louis XVI was thinking about this very shrewdly. He was calculating this, maybe not in a Machiavellian way, but he was thinking 2 moves ahead, right? He was playing chess, mental chess with these guys. And he's thinking to himself, well, if I go ahead and I recognize and I ratify the Constitution, defer to its authority, and recognize the legitimacy, well, then they're going to go ahead and they're going to allow me to continue to maybe not reign as an absolute monarch, but at least maintain me in my status as a king. And I will not therefore lose entirely my regnal prerogatives as a result of acquiescing, at least acknowledging the legitimacy, the constitutional veracity of this document that they created. Whereas, if Louis XVI went in there and said, you know what, hell's to the no, I ain't signing shit. F all you. I'm gonna run off to Austria and I'm gonna get my homeboys over there. I'm gonna come back and we're gonna kill all your asses, right? We're gonna cut your heads off. We're gonna cut your balls off. We're gonna come back here and we are gonna enforce absolute monarchy on y'all. It's gonna be like North Korea up in here, right? With me as Kim Jong Un eating all the caviar and drinking all the Louis the 16th cognac, right? That's a brand of Hennessy. Actually, that's the highest, most elite form of Hennessy. You can actually buy that shit in a little booze store that's about 5 miles away from my house here. It comes in a crystal bottle. I shit you not. Well, why did Louis not do that? Why did Louis not say, hell's to the no, I'm not signing anything. I'm going to continue to insist on my absolute authority, my absolute God-given divine prerogative to rule in a manner that's in accordance with the ways we always rule. Why didn't he do any of that? Because he knew he wouldn't be able to get away with it. That's why. And because he feared the ramifications. He feared the consequences of doing so. He feared not doing what the National Assembly wanted him to do. Now, there's a word for that in the law, okay? And some of you will already know that. There's actually two words for this, right? It's called coercion, number one, or depending on how it actually plays out, the mechanics of it, depending on the jurisdiction. It could also be referred to as undue duress, okay, or making a decision under duress, right? That you are making this decision in extrema, and therefore the consequences that flow from your decision ought not to be legitimated. Right? A court of law ought not recognize the consequences that flow therefrom, logically, consequentially, from you making this decision when you are under duress, right? It's just like, I'll give you guys an illustration, which I think is demonstrative at this point. My grandfather, may he requiesce in pace, right? May he rest in peace, in Latin. On my mom's side of the family. A good old-fashioned Youper, worked in the mines up there in North Tamarack when there was still a mine shaft up there. Actually, there still is a mine shaft up there. Don't go playing around up there. I've been up there many times myself. Actually, I tried to get into the mine, but I couldn't get it. There's actually an opening. There's two openings in the mine up there. There's one where there's actually a burial, a memorial for a young lady who fell into the mine back in the 70s, and there's one just south of that along that road on the north side of county. I shouldn't be giving you guys bad ideas, but don't go out there and don't go exploring old mine shafts, right? Defer to the professionals, right, who are very experienced and very knowledgeable in doing that, and don't really bring working cell phones with them when they actually do that. But no, in all seriousness, my grandfather was essentially he was suffering from the effects of old age and advanced Alzheimer's and deterioration of the mind, and he had diminished mental faculties as a consequence of these physiological and these medical and these neurological mechanisms that were operating on him at that time. And my uncle, rather unsavorily, rather unscrupulously, petitioned him in his debilitated condition, his debilitated mental state. He petitioned him for what I think would rationally and objectively be considered to be undue preference with respect to his inheritance. And my uncle managed to induce my grandfather, in his diminished state of mind, to actually go ahead and modify the stipulations that he had originally made in his will. Right? Modify it in a way which was unilaterally in the favor of this uncle who was trying to intercede on his own behalf. And it's a zero-sum game, right? Because there's only so much property that's split up, and it was between my uncle and my mother, right? Because they're siblings. And so my uncle got more, and the extent to which he got more is the same extent to which my mother got less. And he got more because he decided to, in a very surreptitious and scandalous and very shady way, decided to influence my grandfather's decision-making process when he was in a condition not to actually have him being imposed upon by external influencers such as my uncle, so as to modify the will in a way that was perhaps not in the best interests, in the equitable interests of all parties involved. Now that is undue influence, and you can go to a court of law, you can go to a probate court, and you can petition a judge for redress. You can say, well, I want equitable redress. I want there to be an evaluation of the state of mind of the executor of this will, i.e. my grandfather, at the time that he actually made these amendments to this will and these adjustments. Was he doing so in a manner that was consistent with having full apprehension of the knowledge and the information that was actually relevant and probative to making that decision? And the answer was, of course not, right? He was doing that under duress. He was suffering pain. He was discombobulated. He was disoriented. He was bedraggled. He was beleaguered. He was near death. And as a consequence of the physiological and and medical and biological and neurological effects of all that, he could not have been well disposed to actually make a competent and informed and intelligent decision. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, it's interesting because it's anecdotal and it pertains to my personal life, so I guess for that matter, and also to apprise you guys because I'm sure some of you have older relatives and you got to be wary, right? Don't try to exert undue influence on them when they're in a state of extrema because it would be unbecoming of you and potentially result in ramifications which could actually hold you accountable in a court of law for damages and tort, civil liability, right? So I don't like giving out legal advice, particularly not in a public forum such as YouTube, but nevertheless, that's pretty clear-cut legal advice that any attorney I think would probably corroborate for me. Now, I'm not telling you this just because, oh, it's an interesting story, and that's unfortunate that that happened to my grandfather and then my mother, and we actually ended up going to probate court and fighting this shit. But I'm telling you this because think about King Louis XVI. Think about him going into that National Assembly, right, before he had actually recognized the Constitution. And he knows that if he doesn't recognize the Constitution, then there's the insinuation, the imputation that if you don't do this, then we are going to go ahead, we're going to promulgate this Constitution no matter what, right? We are going to create, we've already created the Constitution. All they wanted was an acquiescence from the king, so as to lend it greater veracity, so as to impart greater integrity to it and legitimacy to it. And I think the real reason they were doing this is because they're looking out to, they're not looking at France necessarily, they're looking at the rest of Europe. They're looking at Spain, Portugal, and Austria, and Prussia, and Das Heiliges Romanische Reich, the Holy Roman Empire. They're looking at those places, right? And they're concerned that the other monarchs of Europe might not actually recognize the legitimacy of this new National Assembly that's now going out there and promulgating new laws and legislating on behalf of the people, unless the monarch himself, who was formerly absolute and formerly authoritarian and formerly had complete unlimited discretion in terms of how he ruled his kingdom, unless that guy went ahead and conceded that, yes, this is actually a legitimate, legal, lawful tender document, and I conspicuously and explicitly, uninhibitedly go ahead and recognize that, right? So I think that that's the reason why the National Assembly wanted Louis XVI. They insisted on Louis XVI acquiescing and saying, yes, I recognize this Constitution, right? For the public record, for all time, for all time, for all places, and for all people moving forward, that this is something that I, Louis XVI, recognize, right? It wasn't so much for the French people. And the reason I say that is because the National Assembly was going to do whatever it was going to do, regardless of what Louis XVI was going to do, right? Louis could have denied that, right? Louis could have said, no, I steadfastly cling to my absolute prerogative to rule you guys pursuant to the notion of the theory of divine rule, right? Divine monarchy, right? He could have done that. But he would have lost his royal privileges. He would have lost his regnal prerogative. There probably wouldn't have been a constitutional monarchy at that point. They would have just said, well, okay, it's time for a republic, right? Since you're not gonna sit down at the table with us, you're not gonna bargain with us, you're not gonna negotiate, you're not gonna concede, you're not gonna compromise. Well, then we don't need you at all. We're gonna create this Constitution, and we're not gonna give you anything. Right? Because remember, the Constitution actually did incorporate some feature of the Constitution did give some consideration to the king. It stipulated not that he could completely nullify legislation, but that he could delay it. Right? So as I say, that's a quasi-constitutional republic, I guess you could say. Not necessarily. Well, I guess a constitutional monarchy is what the term would be, because constitutional republic wouldn't have a monarchy in it at all, right? It's a constitutional monarchy, but it's much more constitutional than it is monarchical, right? It's eight parts constitution and 2 parts monarchy, whereby the monarch doesn't really have much of a place in relation to the dissemination of laws and the ruling of the state. Whereas before it was 100%, right? It was 200 proof monarchy and 0% zero proof constitutional. So I think you could make the argument, and I don't think it's much of a contrivance to actually make this point, to say that, well, Louis only acquiesced and acknowledged this Constitution, not just for the sake of expediency, but he did this because he felt as though he had no choice, and he felt as though he was doing so under duress. Because he knew that if he didn't, then the consequences for him and his family would be dire and serious and swift and punitive, and that he didn't want to suffer that which would be insufferable. And he didn't want to endure that which he knew would come to fruition. And he didn't want to have to impose upon himself and his family conditions that he foresaw, he reasonably anticipated, if in fact he didn't go ahead and acquiesce and acknowledge the legitimacy of the Constitution. And so therefore you could say what he did, he only did because he was afraid not to do it. And therefore he was in extrema. And if he was in extrema, he wasn't necessarily making this decision on the basis of a rational, informed, objective calculus. He was making it under duress, under undue influence, and therefore we go back and we completely obviate, we completely nullify the consequences of that decision. We go back to the drawing board and we say, no, you have to make this decision not while having pressure placed upon you, but rather of your own free will, volitionally, and without fear of any sort of dire consequences or ramifications. And if you make the decision with those qualifications, with those caveats, and you still go ahead and you still endorse and legitimate the Constitution, well, then, of course, then you're bound to it. But until such time as you do, then you're not bound to it because you weren't of sound mind when you actually recognize its authority. And so, therefore, you can't be held to the authority of the Constitution, and the prosecution against the king is being impelled by, is predicated on, arises out of laws that fall under the auspices in the rubric of the Constitution that he in fact recognized. But if you go back again, I think this is a very good point, and I think it's probably the best point that the king can make. All right. Now, what else can we say? Well, what's the rebuttal to that, right? Well, what's the prosecution going to say, right? Those members of the Legislative Assembly who were charged with pursuing this indictment against Louis XVI had their work cut out for them, right? But of course, I think the most salient point that they make, I think the most compelling and the most convincing assertion that they made in the course of this trial was that this is a king who we know had malevolent intentions, who we know acted in bad faith, who we know tried to escape and abscond with his relatives and his personal guard, and abscond to a foreign country, and then elicit and solicit and recruit the support of foreign nationals in furtherance of coming back and making war upon the people and the nation of France so that he could actually restore himself to the condition of absolute monarch. Now, all of those things are incontrovertibly a part of the record. We know that he tried to run away in the dead of night. We know that he tried to run and go across the border and seek refuge in Austria, a friendly state that was friendly to him because they are an absolute monarchy and they wanted to support him and they wanted to restore him and they wanted to establish to the people and all the common peoples of Europe that you can't get away with creating your own constitution, because if you do so, we're going to come back and we're going to reap a horrible vengeance upon you. We know that that's what the king was trying to do. We know he was aspiring to do that. Now, of course, the king is going to say, well, you may have known that I was attempting to escape because you caught me red-handed. But does that necessarily lead to the conclusion that therefore, right, just because you caught me trying to run away in the dead of night, that a fortiori it therefore must follow that I was running all the way to Austria, and that therefore it must follow also necessarily that I was going to recruit an army in Austria, and that therefore it must also follow that I was going to use that army to come back and to strike fear in the hearts and minds of all the people in France and subjugate them once again and rule over them as a bloody tyrant, right? Those are a lot of contingencies, aren't they, right? So you have to say that not only was he running away in night, right, but he was running across the border to Austria. He was going to solicit the help of the Austrian soldiers and the Austrian monarch. He was going to come back with a mostly Austrian army, and then he was going to reap bloody vengeance upon the people of France and restore himself to the throne of France. Well, of course, the prosecution is saying, do you expect us to believe that you were just going to Austria for a holiday, right? There wasn't even the new Disneyland that's there now, right? Disney didn't exist back then, right? There was really nothing. There was shit all to do in Austria. What is there to do? Go climb mountains? Go find the Sound of Music place, right? Because there's that valley where the Van Trapps lived. It's a place where people go and pay homage. Actually, the people who've seen that movie. You guys probably haven't watched The Sound of Music. Well, maybe you have. It's the UP. You guys like old-fashioned Turner Classic Movie type stuff. Go to Austria. There's a valley there in the Ruhr Valley. No, I'm making this up. I don't know where it's at, but there's actually a valley down Valley Road on the far side of Lake Linden. If you go out towards, I think that's the back way of getting to Alma. Kind of as a circuitous way around the back there. That valley there, there's these big hills that go up towards Calumet. It actually is very reminiscent of that scene in The Sound of Music where they're up in the hills and they're singing "The hills are alive with the sound of music." I'm not going to sing the song. Anyways, that's not why he's going to Austria. He's not going there to see the pleasant scenery and enjoy the bucolic lifestyle of a mountain man. He's not doing that at all. This is what the prosecution was asserting. He's doing that in furtherance of the only rational intention he could conceivably have, which was to go out there and to recruit military assistance and to come back and to reinstitute himself as the absolute monarch of the state of France, because that's what he believed in his heart of hearts. That was his conviction. He still maintains, again, this whole argument about ex post facto law, it is contingent upon the assumption, the presupposition that, well, yes, at a certain point in time, before we created this Constitution, he was the absolute monarch, right? And an absolute monarch cannot be overthrown. I mean, here's another argument for the king, right? If I'm anointed by God, if I am corroborated, if I'm confirmed in my position by the church, if the authority which legitimates me and my right to rule over the common people derives from the divine, that by through the hand of God or through the Holy Spirit or through the grace of Christ or however you want to phrase it, right? Whatever semantical trick you want to use to actually pull that off, however you want to put it, rhetorically or otherwise, well, the implication of that is that God, my power comes from God, and He who gives the power is He also who must take it away. And so, therefore, the people, no matter how many of them there are, no matter how they pursue their legislative ends, no matter how unilateral and collaborative they are in this process of creating this new constitution, it doesn't matter. It is inconsequential, right? It is inconsequential because the only authority that can divest me of my right and my power to rule over the people. So I'm ventriloquizing on behalf of King Louis XVI and his advocates. The only authority that can lawfully and rightfully, morally, ethically divest me of that power is the Holy Spirit and the Holy Mother Church and the Lord Himself. Because it was our Lord Jesus Christ, our Savior and our Redeemer, who vested in me the power to rule over all you serfs and you peasants and you PM, all you other riffraff out here. It was the Lord. And if it was the Lord who gave that authority, it is He also who must be the one who taketh away. He giveth and He taketh away, so says the good book, right? And I think that that's a very good argument. It's a strong argument, right? But of course, that presupposes that you're a Christian and you're a Catholic. And France was tired of Catholicism because Catholicism was enabling and facilitating the rule of the monarchy for as long as it had been ruling, right? I mean, one hand washes the other. It's a collaborationist effort, right? And the Catholic Church is in many ways empowered by virtue of their support for the monarchy because they're exempted from taxes and they're a member of this Estates General and they get a special constituent enclave in this tripartite quasi-legislative body and they have overrepresentation in relation to the people and so on and so forth, right? And so the people of France are not just tired of the monarchy and the absolute, unequivocal, unrestrained rule of Louis XVI and especially Marie Antoinette, who we're not really going to have time to talk about. But they were tired of that, but they were also tired of the church because the church enabled the rule of the monarch, right? The monarchy wouldn't have had its moral authority but for the endorsement and the ratification of the Catholic Church in France at that time. Right. Now, what's the other argument of the prosecution? I'm just trying to sit here and think of these things. I mean, I guess the only other argument you could say is that this isn't so much an argument, but I think it's a way in which to conceptualize these things, to have a certain interpretive framework that we have to have, which gives deference to the pragmatic geopolitical considerations that are operative on the minds of the people who are responsible for conducting this trial. Now, what's the concern? The concern that the National Assembly has is the same concern that the Bolsheviks had in 1917 and 1918. And I don't know, how many of you guys have seen the movie Anastasia? Well, I don't know because I'm talking to myself in the basement here, hiding out from tornadoes and severe weather. But I'm going to assume that probably zero of you have seen that movie. It was a Disney movie. I actually have it on the wall over here. I got all my movies back here. If I turn this around, I can show you guys my home theater. It's not mine. None of the stuff's mine. It's all my parents. But it's a badass home theater. I got Nintendo 64 down here. I got Smash Brothers. I got Donkey Kong. I got all the best games. Maybe we'll have a joint lecture / video gaming session the next time I actually do this. And so we'll take our break, right? And I'll turn the laptop around and then I'll go over there and I'll fire up Nintendo 64 and I'll show you guys my mad Smash Brothers skills. And then I got Wave Race skills. I got some Road Rash skills. I got some, what other skills do I have? I got some James Bond 007 GoldenEye skills. Well, anyways, Anastasia is this movie that Disney made back in the 1990s, I think it was. I think it was Meg Ryan, actually, who did the voice for Anastasia. For those of you who are Russophiles, right, and I know one of my comrades, my Ruskaya Davarishi out there, my Russian comrade, I forget your name. I think it was Dmitry, whatever your name is, my bro. I'm sorry. But at least one of you is a Russian comrade, even though you're a Russian comrade. That doesn't necessarily mean you've seen Anastasia. But for those of you who know anything about Russian history, Anastasia was the youngest daughter of the last Tsar of Russia, the last emperor of Russia, Nicholas II. And it was said, it was rumored, it was alleged, and this is just one of the mysteries of histories, but I think it was probably extremely unlikely. And in fact, I think it's been disconfirmed by this. But I don't know about much of the history of the Romanovs, the royal family, but as you can tell. But it was said that Anastasia had escaped the execution squad that was sent to murder the rest of her family. And that she was therefore the last of the Romanovs, right? Because she was the last descendant of the last royal ruling family of Russia, and therefore she carried the royal blood, and through her, successive generations of rightful claimants to the putative throne of Russia could come along and assert that regnal interest, and assert that royal prerogative, and assert that they had legitimate rights that were vested by virtue of them being inextricably associated through blood, through a connection, a bloodline connection with the last ruling family of Russia. Now, the rationale, people don't understand this, but the Bolsheviks, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Kamenev, et al., etc., ad infinitum, I forget the rest of these guys' names, right? But the rulers of Russia, when it was after the 1917 Russian Revolution, overthrew the Tsarist royalist government, and they instituted the government of the people, and the workers and the peasants, the Soviet government. Well, those guys were very shrewd, and they were very savvy, and they were those things because they studied history. And Lenin, if ever there was a Machiavellian character in history, it would have been Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And Lenin understood that if he didn't kill the royal family in its entirety, he extirpate them completely, annihilate them entirely. If he didn't do that, there was the possibility that foreign interventionist governments would perceive the royal family, whatever vestiges remained of them, as the rightful rulers, as the rightful heirs to continue to reassert their right to come back and to rule Russia. Because think about it this way, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And if you are Germany, or if you are the United States, or if you are Great Britain, or if you are a capitalist country and you are antithetical to the interests of the communists because they represent a system that is completely adverse to your own conception of free trade and free liberty and libertarianism and democratic traditions and all those sorts of things, right? If you're one of those countries, you want to ensure that you try to find a legitimate way to insinuate the rulers, the former rulers, back into their position of power as quickly and as expeditiously and meaningfully as possible, right? And so there is a need, there is a very strong, I think, pragmatically induced consideration which compels the National Assembly to ensure that they completely eradicate all vestiges of monarchy in France. Because if there remains some figurehead was associated with the former French monarchy, the ancient regime, the regime that was responsible for ruling France for hundreds of years now. And if that individual, or more than one of those individuals, if that individual or a representative of that family happens to escape from France, well, then these other monarchs are going to, of course, acknowledge that person's rightful authority and their lawful authority as it was devolved from the divine theory of kings, and that they are going to assert that person, that whether Marie Antoinette, or whether it be Louis XVI, or whether it be one of their cousins or their nephews or their nieces or whoever, that person, by virtue of their relationship to the king, right, be it the king or somebody else, somebody related to him, right, that person therefore has the right to come back and rule in either as the king, if in fact Louis XVI is still alive, you can prop him up, right? Or in the name of the king, because the next closest relative would therefore have the right to rule, because there's this line of succession. Okay, I think there's a Netflix show about that. Actually, it's not about the kings; it's about the line of succession in relation to the president of the United States. President, then you got our America's favorite vice president. You got Kamala. Then you got Christ, I should know, the Speaker of the House. And then you got Secretary of State, then you got the Attorney General, then you got Secretary of Defense, you got Secretary of the Interior, so on and so forth. Well, that's the line of succession, right? Which is why, by the way, incidentally, I don't know if you guys know this, but whenever there's the State of the Union address and the president and both houses of Congress there meet in the Capitol building for the address, and you got all the Supreme Court justices, you got both branches of government, three branches of government. He who alleges to be a former law school student, and he who alleges to be a professor of political science. Yes, to the two branches of government we have in this tripartite government. Three representatives of three branches of government there in the Capitol building, and there's always somebody out there flying around an Air Force 2 or whatever it is. It's a C-17, I think is what it is, which is the government sort of reinforced, bulletproof, hardcore, fortified version of a Boeing 777, flying around there in the friendly skies over probably Saskatchewan, some place where there's not a lot of missiles and jihadist activity, just in case somebody blows up the Capitol building and they take out 98% of the line of succession. There's somebody there who is the designated successor in the course of the State of Union. Well, that's the problem that the revolutionaries through the National Assembly had. And that's what they're contemplating. They say, well, if we don't completely eradicate the monarchy and all vestiges, all signs of the monarchy, well, then some monarchist advocate or partisan, whether it be from Austria or the Holy Roman Empire or Spain or wherever, some other autocratic monarchical country is going to come along and they're going to say that in the interest, in the name of Louis XVI, in the name of the martyred Louis XVI, we already killed and we guillotined, we took his head off along with his wife Marie Antoinette, his frivolous wife. We took their heads off, right? In the name of those two, we come back and we present the Duke of Orleans, right? The Count of Champagne, right? The Count of Poitiers, right? I can't think of any other French districts or provinces or precincts, but they could do that, right? And so you had to ensure that there was no rightful claimant to the throne, which of course the argument on behalf of the constitutionalists and the nationalists and the National Assembly and the revolutionaries is that there is no more throne, right? I mean, literally, we shut off the throne room, right? There's nobody can go in there anymore. Right? It's a museum, okay? But we don't want any person coming through and vestigially claiming those rights and then saying that I am the inheritor, I am the person who upon whom those rights devolve. Those rights devolve upon me because Louis and Marie Antoinette, the king and queen, are now dead, and maybe their next closest relatives are dead. But you got this other royal person, right? You got this other person who's related to the king, who comes along after the fact and says, I'm going to be king, right? And then you got all the monarchists there in France saying, we humbly, we bow down and we worship you, right? Well, they don't say that, but we acknowledge and we acquiesce. We acquiesce, we acknowledge your legitimate right to be the next lawful claimant of the throne pursuant to the theory of divine right to rule. The National Assembly couldn't have that. And so I think they understood that if they're going to subject Louis XVI to a trial, then it made sense to ensure that he would never have the opportunity to escape either his confines. They would imprison him for life, right, or at least imprison him to the extent that they could ensure that they controlled the incipient stages of this new republic against any foreign intervention, right? But I think even it would be much safer for the National Assembly on behalf of the people, the revolutionary spirit and the ethos in France at the time, much safer to just go ahead and kill the king. Now, what deleterious implications might there be if you're a revolutionary, if you're Maximilien Robespierre, who was a lawyer, a very brilliant lawyer, and a very brilliant orator, and a rhetorician on par with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini and JFK and all the best rhetoricians that I can think of in the course of history. A very brilliant speaker, a demagogue, if you will, in the traditional sense, the Greek sense, not in the Donald Trumpian sense. What would Robespierre say with respect to the verdict, right? And what sort of verdict we ought to impose upon the king? Well, I think I already told you the verdict was guilty, right? But there's a verdict phase and there's a sentencing phase, right? And that's the way it works in courts, and that's the way it worked in the National Assembly, because the National Assembly was serving as a court. Well, that's another argument. I'm sorry, guys, I got to backtrack a little bit here, but the National Assembly is what's the problem with the National Assembly serving as the judge, jury, and executioner here? What's the problem with them serving as the tribunal in relation to Louis XVI? They're not a trial. They're not a court. They're not a jury. They're not a lawfully convened judicial assembly which has the right to adjudicate matters of sovereignty on behalf of the French people. That's not their prerogative. That's not their responsibility. That's not their right. No, the National Assembly is only a legislature. That's what they are. That's what they claim to be. That's what the Constitution asserts that they are. They're not. And since when does a legislature also behave as a jury? Well, you could say, but Jeff, you're forgetting the United States Constitution, and it makes certain stipulations that if, in fact, you have a president who is violating certain precedents, he's acting in a manner that is inconsistent with his duty to his office, well, then you can have this process that's known as impeachment. And then he goes before both houses of Congress, and then they serve as a jury to adjudicate and to arbitrate and to delineate the scope of his responsibility, to assign culpability to his actions. Yes, but that's the United States Constitution, right? And that Constitution is very different than the French Constitution, right? French Constitution didn't have anything in there like that, right? And there was no precedent for doing that, okay? Precedent is just saying that we do this based on the tradition of it having always been done this way, right? And that's another problem with this whole trial, is that it is in fact, in a word, it is unprecedented. No other people in the history of to my recollection, I'd have to sit here and I'd have to think through the epochs and the ages, all the way back to the vast, many multi-millennial span of time, which we deal with when we evaluate these kinds of events. But I can't instance a single event that is similar to this in terms of how it actually played out, the mechanics of it, with respects to a people that was animated by rage, a righteous indignation, and it felt a need to vindicate their past sufferings, and therefore overthrew their monarch, and then, by process of trial, held him accountable to their elected legislatures. I can't think of. I guess the only instance that I can think of would be the trial of King Charles. I think it was Charles the. Oh Christ, I can't remember, but it was Charles of England, played by the same guy that played Obi-Wan Kenobi for you Star Wars fans of the original old trilogy, the only good trilogy, well, the best trilogy in my estimation. But Alec Guinness played Charles, and I think it was Charles the Second, I want to say. And Charles the Second was put on trial before the Parliament. So I guess you could say there was sort of a precedent, but that's a precedent in a different country. And you can't say that because a different country has done it thus wise, that therefore that establishes a precedent for us here in this country to follow. No, you have to have your own national precedent that's inherent to you, endemic to your country, and has been done before in your nation. Well, of course, you're going to say, of course, the next question is, well, Jeff, what are you talking about? If you always have to have a precedent before you act in a manner consistent with your interests, well, then where's the first precedent, right? I mean, it's an infinite regression, right? You got to have a starting point, don't you? Right? Well, I'd say, well, yes, of course you have to have a starting point, but the first starting point, which establishes that initial precedent, which you therefore follow, that's the tradition which you then cling to and cleave to and refer to, which vindicates the way of doing something in the future. That initial tradition, that initial thing, that action that you're undertaking, has to be logical, right? It has to be based on either law or logic or some kind of rational calculus. I mean, it has to be comprehensible. And many people, especially the monarchists, but even the people in the middle in the National Assembly, many of them were very concerned about this quasi-judicial process, right? Because again, this had never been undertaken before. A legislative assembly serving as a jury for a king who's only been accountable to God for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's who he's accountable for, essentially accountable to no man, right? And no representative of man. So I think that's a problem, that's a dilemma, okay? And that is, I don't know whether or not this is a point that was being made by the advocates for Louis XVI, but it was a point that they should have made because I think it's a very important one. So what's the concern here? What's the concern? What happens if we don't? Let's go to the guilt phase. Contemplate the possibilities. What can we do with Louis? Well, we're the National Assembly. We create the Constitution. We can do whatever the hell we want, right? Well, just about, right? You can do whatever the hell you want, true. Yeah, free will, okay? You can act in accordance with your own volitional prerogatives, right? But at the same time, understand that there will be consequences and perhaps very dire ramifications for what you do. And so, of course, the National Assembly is trying to apprehend what the consequences are going to be if we do A, then will B or C or D follow, right? And what can we say? What are the possible outcomes? Well, the outcomes of this quasi-judicial legislative assembly, doubling as a jury, serving as the adjudicators of the guilt and the culpability of Louis with respect to the charge and the indictment of treason. The outcomes are these. From I guess, ascending order, starting off with the least punitive, the least draconian, the least in terms of the consequence of the punishment for the I don't know what to describe Louis XVI as. I mean, the culprit, the defendant, I suppose. You could just let him go, right? What happens if they let him go? Where is he going to go? He's going to go to Austria, or he's going to go to Germany, and he's going to seek safe haven. He's going to seek safe harbor. And what is he going to do when he goes and establishes himself there? He's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of connections. He's got a lot of influence. He's got a lot of prestige. And what is he going to do? He's going to leverage that money, that influence, those connections, and that prestige, and he's going to leverage that in furtherance of recruiting a military force so as to come back and to engage in war against the state of France. That is the assumption, and that is the logical conclusion that had to be presupposed at the time that this trial was happening, because that is precisely what motivated Louis XVI to try to run away in the first place. Because he's already shown himself to be a flight risk, right? You guys know what a flight risk is. Okay, you got these. I was just watching the movie Traffic the other day. It's on Netflix. I think maybe it was on HBO, but HBO Max actually. Traffic, good movie. Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones and Benicio del Toro and some other people. And the movie Traffic has this scene where they got this major drug distributor. He's the biggest distributor of cocaine in the southwestern United States, and they've got all these charges. They've got the bill of indictment is like got 30 different felony charges: murder, suborning murder, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to distribute, conspiracy to produce, manufacture drugs, all kinds of things, right? And they deny bail. All right, the judge denies bail because they say, well, you're a flight risk. Okay, so he was saying, well, we can post bail to the tune of $5 million because this guy's worth $100 million, whatever he was worth. The judge decides, nope, going to cancel bail. No bail for you because we know that as soon as you post $5 million bail or whatever we set it at, then you're gonna make the bail. You're gonna go out there and you're gonna get the one way ticket to Zimbabwe or Chechnya or wherever the hell you're going to go, not a non-U.S. extraditionary country, and then you're going to live out the rest of your days in fabulous, ostentatious wealth because you got all kinds of overseas accounts and you got all kinds of money that you've made by selling coke to kids, right? And so bail's denied because you're a flight risk. Well, that's the argument against Louis XVI, right? Against just letting him go. He's a flight risk, and if ever there was a flight risk, it is a former king who is vindictive. Okay, or so we have to assume, right? Because if the people of France assume that he's just a very altruistic and noble and congenial and compassionate sort of guy, he doesn't really care about any of this. He doesn't care that we overthrew him and established a constitutional monarchy. He doesn't care about any of that. He's not going to hold any of that against us. If they assume that and they're wrong, well then what's the consequences for them? Well, the consequences for them is that he goes out there, recruits an army of Austrians and Germans and Spanish and whoever else he can afford, comes back, overthrows the Republic, overthrows the Constitution, overthrows the National Assembly, and then exacts his retribution, his bloody vengeance upon the people, the common people of France. They can't afford to assume that. They don't have the luxury of such assumptions. So we can't let him go because we know what's going to happen reasonably, not just conceivably. Not just, well, it's possible. It's something we can apprehend as a possibility, as a vague No, it's a very serious, I think a very realistic possible. In fact, I would say it's the most likely probable thing. It's not just possible, it's highly probable. That if we let him go, he's going to come back here and he's going to whoop some ass when he gets back here with all his Austrian homeboys. We can't allow that to happen. What's the next thing the National Assembly could have done? They could have imposed upon him the sentence of house arrest, right, or life in prison. We'll put you in, we'll put you in the I don't know, with the dungeons or something, right? I'm trying to think of the name of the place in the Count of Monte Cristo, the prison that they send Edmond Dantes to, and I can't think of it, but it's a very isolated place off the southern coast of France, off the coast of Marseille. It's actually near Corsica, where Napoleon ended up going in exile. But anyways, I'll think of it later. Great movie, by the way. The original as well as the remake. The one with the guy who played Jesus Christ in The Passion of the Christ. I can't remember his name. Jim Caviezel. So what happens if Louis XVI is confined to prison for the rest of his days? What's the concern for the National Assembly? Why do you think they wouldn't vote for that? Right? Because during the guilt phase, that there was a divide in terms of what penalty was going to be imposed upon the king. Okay, there was a sharp divide. It was like 360 to 319, right? And 360 in favor of death, okay, and 319 in favor of a term of an indeterminable term of imprisonment, to be later defined pursuant to the evolutions of the Constitution and the needs of the Republic and the interests of the people and safeguarding the interests of the state, and various other stipulations. Right. Well, that's a bit uncertain. There's a lot of ambiguity to that, right? So that's that, and in some ways, right? If you're going to have a sentence, it better be unambiguous. It better be a sentence of consequence. It better be definitive, right? You better know what the sentence is going to be, because if you don't know what the sentence is going to be, well, then you have a right to challenge that. So they don't want an ambiguous sentence, and I don't think they want an ambiguous message, right? Because just putting him in prison, that doesn't necessarily say that he's this really terrible guy and he's a bloodthirsty, despotic monarch and he's this tyrannical, despotic guy who's going to come back and he's going to exact his retribution. Think about it this way. If the National Assembly really wants the people to believe, the people of France, well, of course they already believe this, but they want the world, the other monarchists out there, the people of Europe to believe that Louis XVI is in fact this existential threat to the continuation of this experiment in democracy. If they really truly want to persuade the rest of Europe and indeed the rest of the world and their new brethren, their comrades across the Atlantic and America, they want to persuade all these people of this, well then why would they put him in prison? If he really is this monstrous, despotic, tyrannical threat that is in many ways anathema to the continuation of a constitutional form of governance, if he is all those things that are alleged in the Bill of Indictment, then you have to kill him. It seems to me that it's a foregone conclusion, right? If you presuppose that Louis XVI is in many ways the embodiment, the personification, the very paragon, the antithesis of republicanism and democracy and libertarianism and all the sorts of ideals and ethos that is embodied in the Constitution that the National Assembly promulgated, if he is all those horrible and wretched things, then you need to kill the son of a bitch. Because if you don't, you're essentially communicating that he's not actually as bad as we construed him as being. And so therefore you're undermining the legitimacy of the integrity of the process, because you're essentially allowing the inference to be drawn that, well, he wasn't really that bad. Because if he was that bad, they would have killed him. And they didn't kill him, and so therefore we must say that he wasn't that bad because they let him live, and so therefore they must have assumed that he was actually a pretty good guy. And if he was a pretty good guy, because they didn't want to kill him, and so therefore he must not have been a bad guy, well then who's to say he's not such a bad guy after all? And who's to say he shouldn't have the right to go back and sit on that throne and become the absolute monarch if he's not such a bad guy? There you go. So to my mind, I think to the mind of the more legally inclined and analytically driven legislators who sat there in judgment of King Louis XVI, or Louis, Citizen Louis as he was known at the time, Citizen Kane, right? Who sat in judgment of him, they said, this is a zero-sum game, right? We got to bifurcate. This is one way or the other, okay? It's either we're going to go all the way or not at all, okay? And so I think it had to be death. To the minds of many of them, it had to be death. Because if it wasn't death, it seemed to me, and I think it seemed to them at that time as well, that they couldn't necessarily vindicate or legitimate or persuade the people that the indictment against Louis was actually legitimate, that it actually had any veracity or legal or moral integrity to it. Because if you're not going to kill this guy, then is he really as bad as you would have people believe that he is? And if he's not that bad, then who's to say that we can't actually trust him going back and becoming the monarch again? Because one of the arguments that Louis makes in the course of his defense of himself is that he's not such a bad guy. And that's a fair point. It's not the only, it's a subjective sort of statement, right? What do you mean by not a bad guy? You mean you're not Hitler? You mean you're not Pol Pot? I mean, what do you mean? Well, he wasn't a bad guy relative to some of the kings that they had in the past, right? He wasn't as bad as Louis XIV, the Sun King, okay? Very profligate, very promiscuous in his spending, very degenerate, personally debauched, morally debauched. They made a movie about him with Leonardo DiCaprio, just called the Man in the Iron Mask. Stupid movie, good music, by the way, very moving, very poignant soundtrack. I think it was Hans Zimmer that wrote the music for it, as he usually does. But it's about, well, I won't give it away, but Leonardo DiCaprio plays Louis the 14th, I think it was, maybe the 13th, the Sun King, anyways. And he was the great-grandfather of this Louis, or the grandfather. It doesn't matter, but he was a former monarch, and he ruled in a very indiscriminate manner, a very callous and capricious manner, which suggested a great deal of personal indifference to the sufferings of his subjects. Now, you could not say those things about Louis XVI, the guy who's being dragged before the National Assembly and put on trial for his very life. You couldn't say that. So, to a certain extent, I think the judgment of history is this. He was a scapegoat. The people of France needed a symbolic scapegoat. Somebody whom they could literally assign culpability for all the liabilities that have been imposed upon them, all the sufferings, all the terrible abuses of their rights as people, all the human rights abuses, all the way to the past, to time immemorial. They had to look to somebody and to say, we have to find a symbolic figurehead unto which we can assign the responsibility, the moral weight, the moral and legal culpability for all the past grievances, for all the insufferable things that were inflicted upon the common people of France, all the way back across the ages, all the way back to the ancient Merovingian dynasties, ever since the founding of the royal monarchy in France. We have to find a figurehead. Somebody has to stand in the stead of all those other devious and degenerate and debauched and invidious monarchs who ruled us in a very capricious manner. Somebody has to be held accountable, and if not Louis, or if not Marie Antoinette, his beloved wife, if not them, then who? Sounds like a pretty good argument to me. All right, it's the figurehead argument. All right. Now, look, this is not a legal analysis class, and it may seem as though it is from what I've been talking about for the past 45 minutes, coming up on an hour and a half here. And by the way, I promised myself that I wasn't going to go over an hour and a half because I went an hour and 53 minutes exactly last time, despite the fact that I told you guys that I was going to go much shorter than that, out of consideration for the fact that you guys should have a break. But I'm not giving you guys breaks because it's just me talking on a monologue for however long it is. I don't know if I'm going to be able to not do an hour and 53 minutes, actually, because I still got a lot of shit I got to talk about, or I'm supposed to talk about. And if I don't talk about it, you know what? So what? We don't have to talk about it. And maybe some of you guys are getting bored to death about the French Revolution. I actually think this business about the trial of Louis XVI is probably the most interesting thing that we've talked about, at least in the scope of, that falls under the auspices of the French Revolution, the rubric of that in general. And it's not just because I like talking about legal stuff, and I do. I find it to be intrinsically fascinating and very compelling. It's also just because it allows for a lot of interpretive nuance, right? There's going to be a question on the next exam, on the first exam, that will essentially invite you to take a side. You be an advocate on behalf of Louis XVI. Be his counselor. Be his confidant. Be his attorney at law. And represent his case as eloquently and as convincingly as you possibly can. And bring to bear, in furtherance of your arguments, all the many various points that I went through, and adduce the proofs, and provide me with all of the analytical nuance that I aspired to provide you with over the course of the last 45 minutes. And do it as clearly and succinctly as you possibly can. Or do it not and lose points. Or, conversely, go ahead and play the part of Maximilian Robespierre, the people's advocate, the prosecutor general on behalf of this case, and go out there and make the case against Louis, and tell me why he was a wretched, diabolical, devious tyrant that needed to be extirpated. His blood needed to be extirpated. He needed to die because we couldn't afford not to kill him. Is that really the argument that you can make? I don't know. It's up to you. You take the historical facts as they are, and you put whatever interpretive spin you can on them. Okay? That's what this is all about, my friends, my comrades. All right. Let's talk about whatever the hell else I can find in my notes. How about that? Okay? Or, I don't know if you guys can see this beyond my right shoulder. There's actually a miniature Lionel HO scale train set over there. I could just go over there, and in the next lecture, actually, I could teach from. There's an area where you can stand there, and you got these controls for the trains. You can drive them around, and I can drive the trains around while also simultaneously lecturing. And we can try to like drive the trains fast enough where they'll jump off the rails, and then we'll like put cars and things to make them explode, and we'll set up like a little movie stunt area, and then we'll reenact some historical scenes there using all that. No, that's a ridiculous idea. What am I talking about? I'm talking shit. All right. I'm talking shit because I'm running out of good stuff to talk about, right? See, this is where I should just cut it off and say, okay, you guys are good to go. But I can't because there's still notes here to be read. Not much, though. I got one more page of notes. Okay. So there were two considerations that, to my mind, were really the most salient motivational factors as to why the revolution became radicalized, as to why it became more violent, as to why it required the spilling of the blood of so many people. Because the French Revolution was much, much more bloodthirsty, shall we say. We can characterize it as that, I think, accurately, than, let's say, the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution was, you could say it was bloody in the sense that it facilitated a war, or was consummated by virtue of a war, the Revolutionary War, right? But look, blood, to say that it was bloody by virtue of there being a war seems to me to be a bit disingenuous to the term of war, right? What does war necessarily imply? What does it necessarily demand? War, by its essence, by its definitional criteria, essentially necessitates that there will be destruction, there will be chaos, and above all, there will be loss of blood. So in that sense, yes, because it engendered a war, therefore it was bloody. But I think that the French Revolution was in many ways much bloodier, or the blood that was shed was far worse. It was a more repugnant form of killing precisely because it wasn't killing done in the context of a war. We can understand death in war because you're fighting an enemy, an antagonist who is intent on killing you, and so therefore you have to kill him before he kills you, and that's just kill or be killed, and we all understand that. That's just fundamental principle of an axiomatic principle to human nature. But if you're in a country which is not afflicted by civil war, because in France, in most parts of France anyways, there wasn't anything resembling civil war. It was merely just a retributive form of punishment that was being exacted upon people who were perceived as fomenting conspiracies against the radicals who wanted to implement their own revolutionary agenda. And as we probably know from the advent of fake news and from all the sorts of insinuations that have been made over the course of the last couple of election cycles by candidates on both sides, right? I mean, just think about it this way. If the French were living in an era of fake news, but instead of listening to fake news and saying, oh man, I really think that Joe Biden is an old decrepit douchebag who doesn't deserve to be president, right? Or instead of thinking, oh man, I think that Donald Trump is a disgusting, despicable degenerate who actually wants to have sex with his daughter Ivanka because he actually literally said that she's really hot. And actually, by the way, he actually did say something to that effect, right? My ex-fiance has got an absolutely gorgeous daughter. She's one of the most beautiful women I've ever known, but she's like my little sister, right? And I couldn't imagine saying to her or conceptualizing her in such a way as to say, oh man, she's so hot, I'd really want to do this to her, right? Absolutely not. That seems to me to be despicable, right? But those are the kinds of things that flow from the connotation which fake news has in the context of the ideological sort of paradigm that we find ourselves here in America in the 21st century. Well, imagine that in the era of the French Revolution, fake news was also abundant because there was all manner of hearsay and conjecture and speculation and conspiratorial type thinking that arose and that was profuse in the context of France at this time and was being disseminated and promulgated all amongst the people, the common people who didn't have a way of betting it, corroborating it, didn't have any way of corroborating and confirming it. Imagine instead of thinking that this guy's a douchebag or this guy has, some licentious intentions towards his own daughter, his blood relative. Imagine instead of thinking that, imagine going out there and actually grabbing people from their homes and then bringing them into the town square and then bringing them up to this chopping block and cutting their heads off on the basis of mere hearsay and conjecture and speculative rumor. Imagine doing that. It's rather reminiscent of the sort of the sort of rampant speculation that was responsible for driving the witch craze, right? You can look at this in the context of various examples, which I think are more or less demonstrative of this particular principle. But the notion of a witch hunt, right? Mass delusions, mass delirium, mass hysteria. And mass hysteria was gripping France at this time. And the thing that was animating mass hysteria, the thing that was the incipient cause of mass hysteria in my mind, was the very real tangible fear that the people of France, the common people of France, had that not Louis XVI, because we chopped off his head. I think I got to that point in the story. Well, anyways, they took him up to the guillotine, they chopped up his head, and I have a picture of that on the slides, and we're not going to get to that because I just don't have time for it. But they took his head off, right? And shit, there was something else I was supposed to say about this. Well, anyways, but the concern is that there's all kinds of foreign invading armies that are threatening France, and there were, because the Austrians and the Germans and other nations that were ruled by absolute monarchs were literally declaring war on France at this time. And they were declaring war on France because they felt as though they could and because they felt as though they must, as a direct and I think inexorable consequence of the fact that King Louis XVI was in fact executed as a result of the tribunal which sat to adjudicate his guilt. And this tribunal, the National Assembly that I was talking about for an hour or however long it was, they decided to take his head off. They decided to chop his head off as a symbolic demonstration of their contempt for this king whom they repudiated and whose legacy was one of tyranny and despotism and autocracy and draconian punishments for the people, and they felt that you ought to reap what you sow, King Louis XVI, and you represent a tradition which we, the radicals and the revolutionaries, which we abominate and we find to be truly contemptible. And the best way for us to express that contempt, and the most lasting and visceral and most impactful way for us to actually meaningfully express it, is to literally chop your head off in front of a crowd of thousands of people. Imagine that. Imagine going from king, a man who was revered, a man who was literally thought to be ordained by God, divinely sanctioned and confirmed by Holy Mother Church to having his head cut off in front of thousands of people. Imagine that. Imagine. I mean, it would be like bringing the Pope into San Quentin prison and strapping him to the gurney and then injecting phenobarbital in his vein. Find an attack there, right? And hitting him up with some phenobarbital. That would be pretty. I don't know what that would be. I don't even have an adjective to describe that. It would be absolutely incomprehensible to my mind, right? But that's what the people of France witnessed, and they themselves were. I guess they had the blood of the king was on their hands, because their elective representatives were the ones who decided to consign him to such a fate. Now, what can we say about this radicalization? Well, the first point, as I said, the threat from invasion, from outside external invasion, that served to very strongly animate and to fortify the resolve of the French people. It served furthermore to my mind anyways, to imbue upon the French people a sense of solidarity and fraternity, that they're all in this together, and that they need to stand united or they will fall divided, in the words of the great George W. Bush. That we must stand united, we must present a united and consolidated, unified front against all these various external adversaries that threaten the very existence of this newly established republic. Because now we're no longer a constitutional monarchy. No, there's no more monarchy, baby, right? It's just Constitution. The Constitution reigns supreme. And in order to protect this incipient new state that we have created for ourselves, we have to fight dearly, and we have to be willing to bleed. We have to be willing to suffer and to die and risk life and limb. And we all must be willing to do so. And if any of us is not, then those people are deemed, ipso facto, they must be deemed to be traitors against the state. If you are not in it all the way, then therefore it's what Anakin Skywalker says at the very end of Episode 3 when he's battling Obi-Wan and Mustafar in the lava pits, and he says, "If you're not with me, then you are my enemy." And then Obi-Wan, of course, says, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes. I shall do what I must." That's actually really bad. I can do it better when I haven't been talking for a couple hours. But they're essentially saying either you are all for us, you're all in, and you're willing to die on behalf of this newly created French Republic that we have now ordained for ourselves, or if you're not with us 100% of the way, even if you're only with us 98% of the way, that's not close enough. We're going to kill you for the fact that you're 2% with the enemy, right? So it's a zero-sum sort of paradigm, right? Now that, to my mind, is evocative in many ways of sort of the worst kinds of ideologies throughout history. I mean, you think about communism, you think about fascism, you think about Nazism, you think about totalitarianism in any form of variety that it takes, because it takes many different variations, right? But that is the essence of totalitarianism, okay? Everything that is not proscribed is mandated, and all things that are not mandated are proscribed. Meaning that if it's not forbidden, it's required. And if it's not required, it's forbidden. Okay? And actually, I'm borrowing a phrase from, I'm rephrasing a stanza, quote from George Orwell's 1984. Of course, that was a very prescient novel which foreshadowed many of the tribulations of the Cold War and the horrors, the depredations of the Soviet bloc, the evil empire, the Soviet Union. Some would say it's an evil empire. Others would just say it was misunderstood. We're going to talk about that later on. So is that a good thing, living in a state of fear where you've essentially devolved into a police state? And not only is it a police state, but to my mind, it's the worst kind of police state, because it's not a despotic dictatorship anymore. If you have a despotic dictatorship, you have the worst kind of monarchy, let's say, right? You have a Saddam Hussein-esque type scenario whereby you have a ruler who is very capricious, who is indifferent to the sufferings of his people, and let's say he's got a malignant heart, and he likes to go around and he likes to drive his Lambo or his McLaren F1 down the street, and he likes to rape young women. He points out the young women on the street. He has his bodyguards, he's got his entourage, he's got all kinds of AK-47s and all kinds of Glocks and all kinds of weaponry with them, and they throw him in the back of this Escalade, and then they take him back to his house, and he gets them all coked up, and then he rapes them, and then he kills them, and then he throws them in the swamps. Right? I'm actually describing what happened under the reign of Saddam Hussein. If you guys have ever seen any depictions, any graphic depictions of that period, it's absolutely horrible. It's absolutely terrible. But it's in some sort of depraved sense, it's captivating. You can't turn away from it. right? It's got a sort of pornographic quality to it. I mean, it's absolutely stultifying. It's horrifying, right? But it's fascinating that those guys could get away with as much as they did for as long as they did. Well, anyways, what I just described there was what Uday Hussein did, the charming eldest son of Saddam used to do. He used to drive sports cars around up and down Baghdad's main drag and look for young women to rape, and then he'd kill them, have his goons kill him after he raped them, and then he'd also abduct the husband. Sometimes he raped the husband too, and he'd kill him after. Hey, he was a depraved, degenerate guy. I'm sure he's down there in Dante's ninth circle of hell, down there with Judas Iscariot and Cassius and Brutus and the rest of the ninth circle crew. Well, this kind of despotism is the worst kind of despotism. It's a despotism of mass delirium, mass hysteria. Okay, it's what ends up happening is the new form of government sort of crystallizes, it metastasizes, and it takes the form of essentially a council, a ruling council. And this ruling council is dominated by the most radical ideologues, the most base demagogues, the men who are very eloquent and very persuasive in their ability to induce people to follow them. Men like Maximilian Robespierre, who I keep referring to because I admire him in certain ways, even though he was a despotic and diabolical bastard. I admire him in the sense that he was brilliant rhetorically. I mean, if anybody could put together a speech that was very compelling and very motivational, it was certainly a man like Maximilian Robespierre. And men like these become the new rulers of France because they rule by pandering to or appeasing the interests of the people. But because they're such brilliant speakers and such magnificent orators, they're able to compel and induce and motivate and inspire the people to follow their will, to essentially covertly and very subtly and very surreptitiously, very wittily induce the people to go along and do what they secretly, the demagogue, Robespierre and his fellow demagogues, want the people to do for them in their own interests, but to deceive the people into believing that what they're actually doing is for the interest of the people. Right now, that's a trick that even the most brilliant demagogues usually can't pull off, or it takes a very brilliant demagogue to pull off. Demagoguery, the ancient tradition, the Greek word anyways, because it comes down from the classical sources. And a demagogue, we've all heard demagogue, right? We've heard this term bantered around, thrown about on CNN and MSNBC, and they usually refer to Trump. They refer to Trump as a demagogue. I don't think that that's actually true. And I'm not saying that because I'm a defender or a partisan or an apologist for Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump in many ways is a scandalous, narcissistic, pompous douchebag. But he's not a demagogue. And the reason I say he's not a demagogue is because if you actually look at the traditional context of the word demagogue, what does it really mean? It means somebody who is such a brilliant orator, somebody who's so convincing and so cunning and so persuasive that they can make a speech and they can inspire the listeners to follow them to the gates of hell and back. Now, I don't know about you, but Donald Trump always struck me as something of a con artist, right? In fact, that's kind of what he was for a very long time. He was just, his life was just a licensing deal, all right? That's what the guy was. He was just licensing his name to go the Donald Trump the stakes, right? The real estate business, the casino, okay? All the property, all the other bullshit that he was selling, right? Now that to my mind, and if you actually listen to him, you listen to him as an orator, as a speaker, as a man who's giving a speech, not one that's scripted, not one that's actually on the teleprompter screen, but going out there ad-lib, off the fly in a very extemporaneous manner. He's not really the JFK level orator. He's not even the Abraham Lincoln orator. Well, I shouldn't say only, because Lincoln was a fantastic orator. But if you think about what a demagogue really was, a demagogue was somebody who was so brilliant in his rhetorical abilities that he could persuade the common people, not just the common people, but most everybody, okay, except for his fellow lawyers perhaps, right? And it just so happens that most demagogues, at least the most successful of them, happen to also be lawyers, because what they teach you as a lawyer, or to be a successful lawyer anyways, is you have to be very analytical. You have to be able to think things through logically and intuitively, and to be able to do so spontaneously on the fly, and to understand and interpret the consequences of what you're saying before you've actually said it. Now, you wouldn't be any good at making any points if you couldn't do all of that. And so a demagogue is somebody who does that. In fact, it's no coincidence at all that Robespierre was actually a lawyer. He was a very successful and very bright lawyer before he became a politician, as is the case with Obama, as was the case with Clinton, as was the case with Biden. In fact, you guys probably didn't know this. He was a lawyer. He actually sat on the Judiciary Committee for a long time reviewing Supreme Court nominees. Go back and see the videos from C-SPAN back in the day in the 90s, and you'll see a very different version of our president back then, 30 or 35 years ago, than the unfortunate version that we have now. For better or for worse, probably for worse. So Robespierre and his fellow demagogues are very good at inciting and provoking the masses. They are provocateurs. They are extraordinarily adept at that. And what do they provoke in the masses? They provoke fear. They provoke outrage. And most importantly, they provoke the need for retribution. They provoke the need to exact retribution upon the spies and the traitors and those who would betray the interests of the people and the interests of the republic. And this is a very, very terrifying time, because these kinds of speeches play upon the most base impulses that are imbued and endemic to the human condition. It's the worst part of humanity, right? Abraham Lincoln, referring to the great Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. Once again, he said, and I think it was his Gettysburg Address, he said something about the better angels and the worse angels of our nature. He was, of course, talking about the things that impel people to actually acquiesce or accommodate the institution of slavery. And then he goes on to say that he says, just as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master either. And of course, the implication of what he's saying is that not only does slavery dehumanize the slave by making him chattel, by rendering him physical property, but it also dehumanizes the master as well, because you cannot actually maintain slaves unless you treat them in a manner that is unbecoming of a human being to be treated. And so that was the import of the Gettysburg Address. So for those of you who didn't actually understand that, or who are too cheap to go out there and buy the Cliffs Notes version of it, there, I explained it for you. Okay, not that you care, but you can thank me later. Shit, I've only got a few minutes. I'm sorry about this, guys. If I don't finish this now, I really do have to finish the French Revolution on the next PowerPoint. Not the next the next broadcast, the next production. Yes, this elaborate video production that I have a $2 production value for. I mean, I don't know. I spent 2 minutes at least setting up this chair over here, so I guess that counts for something. I will close by imploring all of you to take these lecture videos very seriously, just as seriously as you would take me if I was actually standing before you in the classroom at 9 a.m. every Monday and Wednesday morning. I would also say that it is, to my mind anyways, right, and you may beg to differ, but if you do, I haven't heard from you yet, but to my mind, it is in your interest as a student to take notes as scrupulously as you are able, as scrupulously as my lucid interpretation of these events and this history allows for. And if I'm not doing a good enough job, then you have to let me know, okay? I haven't heard from anybody yet. I had some questions from one of your comrades, but they weren't critical. They weren't in any way insinuating that I wasn't doing an effective job at representing this material in a way that actually resonated with you. But if you do think that I'm not doing a good enough job, please let me know. And I really do genuinely mean that, because, as I said, I am positively anathema to waking up at 8:30 in the morning to do Zoom. But if it must needs be, it must needs be. And honestly, I don't want to be the kind of guy that says, I'm just going to do whatever is in furtherance of my subjective personal interest, and to hell with the rest of you guys, because to my mind, you guys are the ones who are paying for this. So you get what you pay for, and I want you to have as much discretionary control over this content as possible. I'm just going to think if there's any last points I want to make, but no, I think that's it. For those of you who are wondering, I will close escrow by just making this last point. Some of you are probably thinking to yourself, what the hell did I spend this $15 on this little shit book for, right? And probably was a lot more than that, actually, if you bought it at our bookstore. Most other places, I should know, the bookstore is actually a very good place to buy stuff. They're very nice over there, and I think their prices are generally pretty reasonable. But whatever you pay for the book, I promise you, there will be a time, sometime in the indeterminable future, I can't tell you exactly when, because I don't know where we're going to be at any given time, but there will be a time going forward in this lecture series, whether it takes until October when I actually get back and become reunited with you guys, if in fact I am reunited with you guys, because as I said, you guys may assimilate yourself to this particular mode of lecture content delivery, and you may like the idea of take-home tests. You may say, Jeff, stay the hell away from me. I don't want to have to come and take the test actually in the room, and I don't want to have to get up at 8:30 in the morning to be there on time at 9 a.m. anymore, because I'm to get used to sleeping in just like you. And if that's what you want, fine. But more to the point, we will be using the book. Okay, so don't sell it. Don't give it away or anything like that. Don't throw it away. Don't burn it yet. Right? There is still value. There is still use. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to sort of intersperse periodically. I'm going to punctuate the lectures with me delving into and trying to interpret and discern the meaning of the author, because I think history is if it's anything, if you can say it's anything besides just studying the past and understanding, the implications and the import of certain events, it is really interpretive. Okay, it's all about an analytical framework. It's all about conceptualizing these things in a way that renders them intelligible to you and allows you to render them intelligible to others. Now, the best way of doing that is opening up a book that some smart guy from Oxford wrote, which he, by the way, did, because that guy Niall is a pretty smart guy, and he actually did get his PhD from Oxford. Opening that book and trying to make sense of that stuff and to distill it as lucidly and as analytically and as intelligibly as you possibly can. So we're going to be doing more of that throughout the rest of this term. Okay, I will leave you with that. Unfortunately, I've got my mouse over here. I got to get on my knees and crawl over there because otherwise I'm going to look like a douche. Either way, I'm going to look like a douche, and I hate seeing myself up close on the screen, but unfortunately, that's the way it's going to end here. Guys, thanks for listening. I really appreciate the time, and I hope you're still enjoying this class. I hope it still has some pedagogical and educational value. And if it doesn't, as I said, let me know. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you on, well, whenever it is I upload the next YouTube video. Thanks.